Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the Russian T-10M tank in War Thunder. Both in-game and real life, the T-10M represented a bit of an end of an era to the heavy tank, and we're going to look at it and see how it performs. And before we kick this video into high gear, I did actually pick up a new microphone in case you can tell, so any feedback on that would always be appreciated. Do you like it? Do you dislike it? Do you like the old audio recording better? Please let me know down in the comments. And we'll start out by briefly looking what the T-10M actually is. The T-10M originally started life as the IS-8, which was a Russian heavy tank and one of the last Russian heavy tanks to ever be produced. The IS title was actually removed because it was associated with Joseph Stalin, and after his death, they decided to separate themselves from that a little bit. In the game of War Thunder, the T-10M is currently the highest battle rating tech tree heavy tank of any nation. It sits at 8.3, whereas most heavy tanks in the game stop at 7.7 or earlier. There is technically one heavy tank in the game that's above it, and that's the Object 279, although the 279 is not currently available as it's an older event vehicle and you can only really find it either on the marketplace for a large sum of money or in loot boxes, which is entirely random, so it's not really attainable for most players. For the average player in War Thunder, the T-10M is the highest battle rating heavy tank you can actually get in the entire game. So we'll start off looking at its characteristics by looking at its overall mobility. If you were to compare this to something like, say, the IS-4M, the immediate thing you'd notice is that while the engine isn't that much better, it actually does have significantly less weight, so its acceleration in both forward and reverse gears is pretty good. Additionally, while it doesn't have the best reverse gear in the world, it's not awful and you can reverse yourself out of situations relatively quickly. So overall, while I'd rate it as not the most mobile tank in the world, especially for its battle rating where you're starting to see a lot of METs, it definitely can get around enough to where it's not a major hindrance. The armor is where the T-10M starts to get kind of interesting because at this point in the game, you're starting to see a lot of Heat FS, APDS, and even APFSDS shells being slung at you. These shells have both good penetration in general and good angled performance. So the old classic scheme of using rolled homogeneous armor and putting a slope to it is not anywhere near as effective as it used to be. However, it is easy to underestimate the T-10M's armor because it does fight all of these armor negating shells. It does have a lot of layered armor, the sides have some additional skirting on it, the side itself is reasonably heavy, and parts of it can block even some decent penetration darts if it catches a bad angle. That being said, and this is the biggest weakness of the T-10M and a lot of the later heavy tanks in general, there's basically no situation in which you can count on the T-10M's armor to actually hold up unless you're really familiar with specific enemies and what types of shells they're firing. So in practice, this means the T-10M, while it can sometimes absorb punishment, it's less of a true heavy and more of a fat medium, if that makes any sense. The gun is where the T-10M starts to get somewhat interesting. The T-10M is still using the older Russian 122mm, so you will have a stock reload of 20 seconds, which is really underwhelming. Most of the MBTs you'll be fighting around this battle rating will have a reload rate of at least double that, if not more, especially on a good crew. Even on the best possible crew, you're still only getting it to around 16 seconds, which is still incredibly slow. However, it's not without its advantages. Unlike a lot of its predecessors in the Russian heavy tank line, this version of the 122 is actually fully stabilized, and it's one of the only fully stabilized, possibly the only fully stabilized 122 in the entire game. So even while moving, you can crank out some reasonably accurate shots, which is always nice to have. Additionally, you have a stock armor-piercing ballistic cap shell that has a penetration of 295mm maximum, which is more than enough to slice through the vast majority of enemies you will meet at around this battle rating. Additionally, it has a very large explosive filler, so if you do punch through the armor of basically anything, M60s, Leopards, whatever, you will essentially annihilate them. This does allow the T-10M a bit of an advantage in a lot of fights because a lot of opponents at this battle rating will be used to things like cupolas or the very edge of the front of the hull, not necessarily being a kill shot, so they might try to bait you with those aspects of the vehicle. However, in the T-10M, you will absolutely clobber an enemy who decides to poke a little too much of their hull or turret out. So it can give you some advantages in fights, especially with the stabilizer allowing you to snap shots reasonably well, although it is important to note the turret traverse and elevation is fairly poor, and obviously as it's a Russian tank, the depression is also fairly poor. One minor advantage that doesn't really come up that much, but it is very useful when it does, is that it does have a fairly powerful heavy machine gun mounted on top that can shred lighter vehicles and helicopters with relative ease. So overall, while the weapon systems do have some limitations, I found they were probably one of the stronger aspects of the tank, just because they are so reliable and consistent in both penning and killing basically everything you'll meet. Now, I wasn't originally intending on doing any kind of vehicle on the T-10M, it was just one of the vehicles I was spading as I was cruising through the Russian tech tree, except after about 9 games I decided to check my stats because it felt like I was doing well, and I had 2 games where I was close to a nuke. I had a 6-1 KD, and I was also at 100% win rate after 9 games, which obviously I wasn't able to sustain that long term, but I did end with a 3-1 KD and a 60% win rate after I was done getting all the upgrades unlocked. And when I'm going back and reviewing the vehicle and trying to figure out exactly what the strengths of it are, part of it is the relatively long reload and inconsistent armor. You can't just run up into the middle of the enemy and freely brawl, because that will just lead to you getting killed. It only takes 1 missed shot, or even if you land your shot, 1 enemy you didn't see, and you're basically dead. So the T-10M does kind of have to play more methodically, not necessarily cautiously, but you do have to play within the limitations that your armor won't necessarily stop all shells, although it can sometimes stop them, but your gun doesn't really allow you to be hyper aggressive, and that's probably for the best because your mobility isn't super great, at least in forward gears as well. So all of this combined meant you had to kind of think about your positioning and when you wanted to engage enemies a little bit more carefully with the T-10M than you do with a lot of the other MBTs around this battle rating, where you can just drive around and click on people. This might sound like the T-10M is a vehicle that requires a lot of practice to use, but it really doesn't. The thing is, the mobility is good enough, the armor sometimes saves you, and the stock APC-BC shell is actually your best shell that you have available, even though the other shells will have more penetration. Realistically, you don't need that much more than 300mm of pen in most cases, so I did take a few of the Heat FS rounds just in case, but by and large I found I could basically just stick with the APHE shell the entire time I was playing it, and I very rarely had to switch over. And having a really good stock shell on top of the tank being somewhat forgiving in various areas does allow it to be just in general a fairly easy tank to use. So on the whole, if you are running your way through the Russian tech tree, even if your goal is something like the T-90M, I would highly recommend picking this tank up and taking it for a spin. You might be surprised. That being said, this tank is definitely getting to the end of its life cycle. The heavy tank playstyle has started to wear thin, a lot of the enemies can simply negate your armor, and this isn't even including the fact that you start running into aircraft using guided missiles and guided bombs, and at that point the T-10M feels like a bit of a dinosaur. And because of that, and I know this is kind of weird to say, it did make the T-10M feel kind of sad to play. This is basically old school War Thunder at its finest, but now it's running head up into the new top tier and the new meta, and while it does still have some life left in it, you can definitely see the cracks showing in its general playstyle and approach to design. And it's kind of because of that, not in spite of it, that it motivated me to try to play it and spade it, because seeing the last of its kind and how it really stacked up against all of the contemporaries was a very interesting experience. Overall, I feel like you should definitely get it, but you also kind of understand while you're playing it that this thing isn't really the wave of the future. It's more like a relic of the past that has outlived its usefulness. And that concludes our video for today. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you had fun, hope you learned something. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. That always helps out the channel. And as always, don't forget to shoes.